The US government is attacking Venezuela, and it's clear that Washington's goal is regime change. For decades, the United States has tried to overthrow Venezuela's revolutionary left-wing government. And there are a variety of reasons for this. First of all, Venezuela just so happens to have the largest oil reserves on Earth, and US fossil fuel corporations want to get access to those oil reserves. So that's certainly a major factor, but it's not the only one, because the reality is that the US government has for decades been viciously attacking all of the independent left-wing governments in Latin America and has tried to overthrow them to impose right-wing puppet regimes governed by oligarchs who will serve US corporate interests. This goes back to the so-called banana republics when the CIA organized coups to overthrow independent, democratically elected left-wing leaders in Latin America on behalf of the United Fruit Company, now known as Chiquita. This is what happened in 1954 when the CIA overthrew Guatemala's democratically elected left-wing leader, Jacobo Arbenz, who was not a communist. He was simply a left-wing nationalist who wanted land reform. He wanted to give land to landless peasants, to farmers, to help them have a better life. And this angered US corporations, so they overthrew his government. Guatemala doesn't have oil. Cuba doesn't have significant oil reserves either, and yet the US government has tried to suffocate Cuba for over 60 years with an illegal blockade. And every single year at the United Nations General Assembly, nearly every country on Earth, more than 98% of UN member states, vote every year to condemn the illegal US blockade on Cuba, yet it continues in blatant violation of international law. So this is not just about oil. Of course, oil is part of the story, but this is an attempt by the US empire to impose its hegemony on Latin America and overthrow all of the independent progressive governments. And this is especially the case today because we are in a new Cold War. The United States is now waging Cold War II against China. And the US wants to prevent all countries in the region from having close ties with China and also Russia. And Venezuela's revolutionary government is closely allied with China and Russia and also Iran. So the US government has launched many coup attempts in Venezuela, and the Donald Trump administration has started yet another coup attempt to try to overthrow Venezuela's President Nicolás Maduro. And in order to do this, the Trump administration has fabricated some absurd lies, claiming that supposedly it's fighting drug cartels, which is completely ridiculous. Today I'll look at the evidence showing how the Trump administration is lying to justify yet another coup attempt. And another factor to keep in mind is de-dollarization. Now, Trump has repeatedly threatened countries all around the world that try to drop the US dollar and use other currencies in international trade. Trump is very afraid of de-dollarization, and Venezuela has been at the center of the global de-dollarization movement, and not just in recent years, but for at least a decade. Back in 2017, in response to illegal unilateral US sanctions, Venezuela announced that it would stop selling its oil in dollars and would instead sell its oil in China's currency, the yuan or renminbi. And China is the main purchaser of Venezuelan oil. So the US wants to destabilize and overthrow Venezuela also as a message to other major oil producers in the world that there will be severe consequences if they challenge the global dictatorship of the US dollar and try to sell their oil in other currencies. The US empire will not tolerate that. By the way, this is exactly what the United States did to Iraq's former leader, Saddam Hussein. And I'm not saying it was the only reason for the illegal US invasion of Iraq in 2003, but it was certainly a factor. Saddam Hussein had been selling Iraq's oil not in dollars, but in euros, and he was considering selling it in other currencies as well. And the US empire saw this as a major threat to the petrodollar system, which guarantees global demand for the US dollar and allows the US government to run massive deficits while its borrowing costs are much lower than other countries with similar deficits. and the fact that other countries need dollars in order to pay for imports of oil and other strategic commodities also guarantees global demand for US dollars, so the US can continue to run large trade deficits with the rest of the world, current account deficits, without suffering from the significant inflation that other countries that run such large trade deficits would face. So again, this is not a new policy under Trump. For decades, the US government has threatened oil producers around the world to try to maintain the global dictatorship of the US dollar, and Venezuela has been a major challenger to that petrodollar system. So this is another reason why the US government has tried for decades to overthrow Venezuela's revolutionary government. Now, the situation is very dangerous because the US military is directly threatening Venezuela. In late August, the Trump administration deployed 3 warships and more than 4,000 Marines off the coast of Venezuela, threatening war. And then in early September, the Trump administration launched attacks on boats off the coast of Venezuela, killing 11 people in a boat. Now, the Trump administration claimed without any evidence that supposedly these people that the Trump administration killed were drug traffickers. But first of all, I need to emphasize that, again, there is no evidence of this. The Trump administration is expecting us to take them at their word. But second of all, even if it's true that these were drug traffickers, the US government can't just kill them. These are foreigners in foreign territory. This is a blatant violation of international law. This is either an act of war, the US is declaring war on Venezuela, or it's an act of international terrorism. And a legal expert who's a professor of law at New York University, who was previously a professor of law at Harvard University, named Ryan Goodman, he previously worked for the Pentagon, that was known previously as the Department of Defense. The Trump administration has now rebranded it as the Department of War, the original name, which really shows the true priorities of the US military. It's about waging war around the world. But anyway, this former Pentagon lawyer from Harvard, Ryan Goodman, explained on Twitter that this is either murder or a war crime under international law that the Pentagon considers applicable. Even if these people were supposedly part of a drug gang, again, where there's no evidence of that, this drug gang that Trump is claiming they were part of, Tren de Aragua, is not recognized by the United Nations and international law as a terrorist organization like a group like Al-Qaeda. So the US can't just kill these people. So again, it's either a war crime and an act of war, or it's international terrorism. And this ridiculous narrative that the Trump administration is trying to manufacture, that Venezuela is supposedly a major producer of drugs, is completely false. All we have to do is look at basic data from the United Nations, from leading international experts on the global drug trade, and we see that Venezuela's role in global drug production is very minimal. In fact, Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia, is responsible for the vast majority of the production of cocaine in the world, nearly 2/3, according to UN data. And it's not a coincidence that Colombia is historically the closest US ally in Latin America. In fact, the multimillionaire right-wing former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, who has historically been one of the closest US allies in Latin America, he has been closely linked to drug cartels for decades, and US intelligence agencies have known this, and yet the US government strongly supported Uribe when he was the president of Colombia. In Orwellian fashion, Washington claimed that Uribe was helping to fight the so-called war on drugs, while in reality, this political leader of the right wing in Colombia, the most powerful politician in the country, was working very closely with the infamous Medellin cartel, led by his longtime friend, Pablo Escobar, the most notorious drug dealer in history. The ridiculous US double standard on drugs is also very clear when you look at another close US ally in Latin America, which is Ecuador, which is governed by a right-wing pro-US president named Daniel Noboa, and he is from one of the richest families in Ecuador. His father, Álvaro Noboa, is one of the richest people in all of the country. He's a billionaire, and he owns a banana trading company. and has private ports in Ecuador. And it's widely known in the country, it's been widely reported on, that he uses his banana trading company and his private ports to smuggle cocaine in banana crates and to export that cocaine to other countries. Meanwhile, Daniel Noboa is a close ally of the US government. He was invited to Donald Trump's presidential inauguration. And what's even crazier is he's a US citizen. He's a dual citizen of the United States and Ecuador. Even though he's the president of Ecuador, he was born in Miami, Florida. He spent a lot of his life being raised and educated in the United States. And yet now he's governing Ecuador on behalf of the United States. He signed a law that allows the US military to enter Ecuador at any time for any reason without the approval of the Ecuadorian government, which is basically just neo-colonialism. And everyone knows that his family is closely linked to drug cartels, and yet the US government has no problem because he's a loyal US puppet. This is the reality. So in fact, the US government has for a long time, well before the Trump administration, under both Republicans and Democrats, the US government has long been allied with the worst drug traffickers in Latin America. I explained that in another video, which I will link to in the description below. So it's not Venezuela that's responsible for cocaine production. It's Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia. And then the second biggest producer is Peru, another longtime US ally in the region with a right-wing government. And the third biggest producer is Bolivia. But what the Trump administration is trying to do is not only lying about Venezuela, but it's also very cynically conflating cocaine and fentanyl, because the vast majority of drug-related deaths in the US have been caused by synthetic opioids, not by cocaine, and primarily by fentanyl. And if you look at reports from the US government, from the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, you can see that in the reports on fentanyl flow into the US, they don't even mention Venezuela. They mention Mexico, and of course they also blame China and India for the precursor ingredients that go into fentanyl production. But according to the US government's own data, the vast majority of fentanyl in the US comes from Mexico, not from Venezuela. Venezuela has nothing to do with the fentanyl problems in the US that have caused so many deaths. And by the way, according to the US government's own data, 86.4% of the people who are convicted of trafficking fentanyl into the US are US citizens. The vast, vast majority are US citizens, not Mexicans, yet alone Venezuelans. Venezuela has nothing to do with this. If you look at reports from the United Nations, from leading international experts on the drug trade, they do not identify Venezuela as a country where drugs are produced, including cocaine, yet alone fentanyl. Venezuela is a transit country, along with pretty much every country in Latin America and many countries in Europe. So the cocaine is produced in close US ally Colombia, and then also Peru and Bolivia. And maybe it will go through Venezuela, but it also goes through Brazil and Ecuador and Mexico and Guatemala and Spain and France. But the US government doesn't care about the facts, because this is not about actual facts. This is about a coup attempt in Venezuela. And US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor Marco Rubio let the cat out of the bag when he angrily ranted in a press conference about how the US doesn't care about the United Nations. He attacked the UN experts, and he said that Venezuela's President Maduro, the constitutional president of Venezuela, recognized by the United Nations, Marco Rubio said that he's a supposedly indicted drug trafficker who is a fugitive of American justice, as if the US justice system can prosecute foreign leaders in domestic US courts on fabricated charges made up by the US government. This is absolutely insane. The US government is acting like an international dictator, saying that domestic US law applies to everyone in the entire world, including to foreign heads of state. And the US government fabricates completely false charges against foreign leaders, tries them in absentia in US kangaroo courts, and then tries to imprison them in the US and tries to overthrow their independent sovereign government recognized by international law. Listen to how crazy these remarks are from one of the most powerful people in the U.S. government.
No, you're wrong in your question. Number one, Venezuela is a major source. And the reason why is the following. And I've seen a lot of this reporting, and it's fake reporting, and I'll tell you why. It says that somehow Venezuela is not involved in the drug trade because the UN says they're not involved in the drug. I don't care what the UN says. The UN doesn't know what they're talking about. Maduro is indicted by a grand jury in the Southern District of New York. That means the Southern District of New York presented the evidence to a grand jury, and a grand jury indicted him. And then a superseding indictment came out that was unsealed about a year and a half ago that specifically detailed Maduro's actions. So number one, let there be no doubt, Nicolás Maduro is an indicted drug trafficker in the United States, and he's a fugitive of American justice.
Now, as part of these completely bogus, fabricated charges that the U.S. government has applied against Maduro, Washington claims that Maduro is supposedly the leader of a drug cartel called the Cartel de los Soles, the Sun Cartel, which doesn't exist. It was completely made up by the U.S. government. Before the U.S. government started talking about the so-called cartel, no one else had ever talked about it. Literally, the U.S. government made it up. And this is not just me saying this. Even the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, has said the exact same thing. He tweeted that, quote, "The cartel of the sun, el cartel de los soles, does not exist. It is the fictitious excuse of the extreme right to overthrow governments that do not obey them," end quote. Those were the words of Colombia's democratically elected president, Gustavo Petro, who is the first independent leader of Colombia, really in modern history. He's the first left-wing leader of Colombia ever in its history. For almost all of Colombia's modern history, it has been governed by right-wing oligarchs who were obedient U.S. puppets, who did whatever Washington wanted. Petro is the first ever independent leader, which is why, by the way, the Trump administration has been linked to coup attempts to try to overthrow Petro, and in particular, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been constantly attacking Petro and the Colombian government. But Petro has made it very clear that the U.S. government fabricated these claims to try to justify a coup attempt, and Petro emphasized that Venezuela's internal problems should be resolved by Venezuelans, not by outside powers. But the reality is that the U.S. government has launched many coup attempts in Venezuela over the past 2 decades to try to overthrow Venezuela's revolutionary left-wing government, ever since the leftist Hugo Chavez won Venezuela's democratic election in 1998, and he became the elected president in 1999. The U.S. government has been trying to destabilize him. In 2002, the George W. Bush administration backed a coup attempt against democratically elected President Hugo Chavez, and Chavez was actually briefly overthrown, and the U.S. government immediately supported an unelected dictator who was a right-wing multimillionaire oligarch named Pedro Carmona. The U.S. supported him despite the fact that he was not elected. So this has nothing to do with democracy in Venezuela. The U.S. government has been the principal enemy of democracy in Venezuela for decades, trying to overthrow Venezuela's democratically elected government many times to try to put in power right-wing oligarchs who will serve the interests of U.S. corporations, especially oil corporations. Because Hugo Chavez nationalized the oil industry in Venezuela, and he kicked out the U.S. fossil fuel corporations. And the U.S. backed many coup attempts against Chavez when he was president, and then he died in 2013, and Chavez's successor from the United Socialist Party of Venezuela was Nicolás Maduro, who won the 2013 presidential election. And then immediately after, the U.S. launched another coup attempt, a violent coup attempt, in 2014, in which the U.S. backed these violent coup plotters who tried to sabotage the country, who destroyed infrastructure, who erected barricades and burned down buildings and buses. And then in 2017, they used the exact same tactics, the infamous Guarimbas, to launch another violent coup attempt. And by the way, those coup attempts were under Barack Obama, the Democrat, who in 2015 declared Venezuela to be a so-called extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, which was completely bogus, as if Venezuela is going to attack the U.S. But the reason that Obama did that is because this was the way for the White House to justify imposing illegal unilateral sanctions, which violate international law. But starting in 2015, the U.S. tried to crush the Venezuelan economy. The U.S. pressured Saudi Arabia to massively overproduce oil, to crash the price of oil in the global market, which hurt Venezuela. It also hurt Russia right after the annexation of Crimea, when the U.S. began imposing sanctions on Russia. And it hurt Brazil when the U.S. was backing a soft coup against Brazil's democratically elected left-wing president Dilma Rousseff from the Workers' Party, which helped to put the far-right leader Jair Bolsonaro in power. And by crashing the price of oil in the global market, the U.S. also hurt Iran and tried to force Iran to the negotiating table to sign the Iran nuclear deal, which the Obama administration did, and then the Trump administration withdrew unilaterally from this international agreement in violation of international law. So Venezuela has been at the heart of this U.S. geopolitical strategy to try to crush independent countries and rivals, to impose U.S. hegemony on the entire world. And in the case of Venezuela, Obama started imposing sanctions on Venezuela, and then when Trump came in as president in his first term in 2017, he massively expanded those sanctions to try to crush the Venezuelan economy, to prevent Venezuela from exporting its oil. And for 100 years, before Hugo Chavez was even born, before the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, Venezuela has been a petrostate. The vast majority of government revenue for many decades has come from oil exports. Imagine what would happen if the U.S. put an economic blockade on Saudi Arabia. The Saudi monarchy would probably collapse in a week or two, whereas the Venezuelan government has only been able to hold on because there still is popular support for the Bolivarian Revolution, which for the first time in Venezuela's history used the oil wealth of the country to fund social programs, to build millions of housing units for poor and working class Venezuelans, to fund free universal education and health care. This is why the poverty rate had massively fallen, and economic growth was actually very healthy until the U.S. began imposing massive sanctions on Venezuela, and when it collapsed the price of oil in the global market for geopolitical reasons. And this was part of an economic war to destroy Venezuela's economy. And in fact, the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the EIA, publicly boasted about how Venezuela's oil production collapsed because the sanctions prevented Venezuela from exporting oil. Many foreign countries and companies were afraid of doing business with Venezuela because of the fear of secondary sanctions, just like many countries and foreign companies are afraid of doing business with Cuba out of fear of secondary sanctions applied by the U.S. government. So Venezuela's oil output collapsed. Venezuela also could not import the technology that was needed to update and modernize and repair its oil infrastructure because of U.S. sanctions. And the leading United Nations expert on sanctions, known as the Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, Alina Duhan, published a report for the UN in which she estimated that due to the illegal U.S. sanctions on Venezuela, the Venezuelan government lost over 99% of its revenue. This was a brutal economic war to crush Venezuela to try to overthrow its government. And then in 2019, Trump launched another blatant coup attempt in which he appointed a little-known right-wing opposition politician named Juan Guaidó as the supposed president of Venezuela, despite the fact that Guaidó never had participated in a presidential election. He had not won a single vote to be so-called president. But the U.S. forced its allies in Latin America and Europe to recognize this puppet as the imaginary president of Venezuela. And Trump's neoconservative national security advisor during his first term, John Bolton, later admitted in a CNN interview that it was a coup attempt. He, in fact, boasted about how difficult it was to organize this failed coup attempt in Venezuela.
One doesn't have to be brilliant to attempt a coup.
I disagree with that. As somebody who has helped plan coup d'etat, not here, but other places, it takes a lot of work.
I do want to ask a follow-up. When we were talking about what is capable, what you need to do to be able to plan a coup, and you cited your expertise having planned coups.
I'm not going to get into the specifics, but
successful coups?
Well, I wrote about Venezuela in the book, and it turned out not to be successful. Not that we had all that much to do with it, but I saw what it took for an opposition to try and overturn an illegally elected president, and they failed. The notion that Donald Trump was half as competent as the Venezuelan opposition is laughable. But I think there's another...
I feel like there's other stuff you're not telling me, though.
I'm sure there is.
And during the planning for this coup attempt during Trump's first term, Trump repeatedly floated the possibility of launching direct military attacks on Venezuela. This was later revealed by Trump's defense secretary, now war secretary, now that the Pentagon officially changed its name back from the Department of Defense to the Department of War. Again, a very honest rebranding. But anyway, the point is that Trump's previous defense secretary, Mark Esper, who was a vice president of Raytheon. So we see this revolving door between the military-industrial complex and the U.S. government. But Mark Esper, after leaving the Trump administration, he wrote a book in which he revealed that in Trump's first term, when they were making plans to try to overthrow the Venezuelan government, they repeatedly discussed the possibility of launching direct military strikes on Venezuela, attacking Venezuela with U.S. Special Operations Forces, training and arming insurgents to launch an invasion of Venezuela, and launching cyber attacks on Venezuela. And in fact, there was a failed U.S.-backed invasion of Venezuela in May 2020, which was known as Operation Gideon, in which dozens of Venezuelan and Colombian mercenaries who had been trained by U.S.-backed forces in northern Colombia, and then they launched this failed invasion, and they were led by two former U.S. Army Special Operations Forces, but they were caught by Venezuelan fishermen who were part of a union who support the left-wing Venezuelan government, and they told the authorities, and these invaders, backed by the U.S. government, were caught and imprisoned by Venezuelan authorities, and their invasion failed. This became kind of comically known as Bay of Piglets, in reference to the failed CIA-backed invasion of Cuba in 1961, where the CIA tried to overthrow Cuba's revolutionary left-wing government. And later, people involved in this operation admitted to Vice News that the CIA was involved in this failed invasion of Venezuela in May 2020. In fact, the leader of a mercenary company named Jordan Goudreau, who was a former U.S. Special Operations sergeant, he oversaw this botched invasion of Venezuela, training these mercenaries in northern Colombia. And he also admitted that he was in regular contact with Trump administration officials during Trump's first term, and he met with them in Florida. However, after the invasion failed, the U.S. government washed its hands of everyone involved, and the Trump administration said, oh, we don't know who this guy Jordan Goudreau is. We had nothing to do with it, which is obviously how the CIA has always worked. When their operations fail, they just abandon their puppets and say, we don't know about this. It's called plausible deniability. This is why Jordan Goudreau was so angry that he publicly lashed out against the CIA and the FBI, and he said, what's the deal? You were supporting us as we tried to invade Venezuela, and now that the operation failed, you screwed me. And he was screwed by the first Trump administration. So this is not new. The Trump administration already tried a failed invasion of Venezuela using mercenaries. But now what Trump is trying to do in his second term is he's launching yet another coup attempt in Venezuela. But this time, he's cutting out the middlemen. He's not using mercenaries and foreign forces and the CIA. He's using the U.S. military directly to attack Venezuela, to try to destabilize Venezuela. The goal is very simple. It's to overthrow the Bolivarian Revolution, like the U.S. has tried for decades to overthrow the Cuban Revolution and the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua. Now, I should add a quick note for people who might be confused. They say, wait, why is Venezuela's revolution called the Bolivarian Revolution? What does it have to do with Bolivia? Well, it's named after Simón Bolívar, who was the revolutionary general who in the 19th century created an army to successfully defeat and expel the Spanish colonialists, the Spanish Empire from South America. And Bolívar created the modern day states of Venezuela and Colombia and Bolivia. Bolivia is named after Simón Bolívar. And Hugo Chavez was a revolutionary left-wing military veteran, an officer from the Venezuelan military who became a politician. And after he won the 1998 presidential election in 1999, he became president. And he then later launched the Bolivarian Revolution, inspired by Simón Bolívar. And he emphasized that the U.S. empire has replaced the Spanish empire and the Portuguese empire as this foreign colonizer trying to impose its hegemony on Latin America. In fact, Simón Bolívar himself recognized this in the 19th century. Bolívar famously said, quote, "The United States seems destined by providence to plague Latin America with misery in the name of liberty," end quote. And this is exactly what the U.S. has done for over 200 years with the colonial so-called Monroe Doctrine. And this is exactly what the Trump administration is doing in yet another coup attempt in Venezuela today. So I want to talk a little bit more about the deceptive tactics and the lies that the Trump administration is trying to use to justify this coup attempt with the absurd false accusations that supposedly the Venezuelan government is led by a drug cartel. Marco Rubio, who is a neocon who has supported every single U.S. war, and during Trump's first term in office, by the way, Marco Rubio was pressuring Trump to launch a U.S. military invasion, to send troops to invade Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. And today, this neocon warmonger is the second most powerful person in the U.S. government after Trump, and he's helping oversee another coup attempt in Venezuela. This July, Rubio tweeted from his official Twitter account as Secretary of State. He said, quote, "Maduro is not the president of Venezuela, and his regime is not the legitimate government. Maduro is the head of the Cartel de los Soles, a narco-terror organization which has taken possession of a country, and he is under indictment for pushing drugs into the United States," end quote. This is the Secretary of State announcing what is essentially the beginning of yet another coup attempt in Venezuela. Then the next day, on the 28th, the Trump administration increased the bounty on the head of Venezuela's president. So back in Trump's first term, during the coup attempt, the Trump administration put a bounty of $15 million for the head of Nicolás Maduro. Well, this July, in his second term, the Trump administration increased that bounty to $25 million for the head of Maduro. And then, as if that weren't already crazy enough, just over a week later, in August, they further increased the bounty to $50 million. This is mafia behavior. This is what mafias do. The US government is acting like a global mafioso. And the hypocrisy of this is really impossible to overstate. Because if you go to Marco Rubio's Twitter account, you can see that Rubio tweeted support for the notorious corrupt right-wing former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, who is very closely linked to drug cartels and worked directly with the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar. And yet, literally an hour after tweeting support for this Colombian narco leader, then Marco Rubio retweeted the wanted poster from the DEA calling for the head of Nicolás Maduro. I mean, the double standard is just staring us all in the face. It is incredible. The US government is openly supporting one of the most corrupt, drug-linked leaders on earth while accusing Venezuela's president of supposedly being a narco-terrorist. And I have to emphasize that the US government has not provided any evidence. There is no proof of this whatsoever. It's all based on the politically motivated accusations made by the Trump administration. And scholars in Latin America have investigated this, and they have called into question whether or not this so-called cartel of the suns even exists. So a Spanish academic named Fernando Casado Gutierrez, who is not Venezuelan, he's from Spain, and he's a professor of law at a university in Ecuador. And he did research on this, and he investigated, and he tried to find evidence that this so-called cartel of the suns exists. And in this research paper, this Spanish scholar concluded, quote, "The lack of evidence led us to conclude that the vaunted cartel of the suns, as portrayed by the media, simply does not exist. The cartel of the suns is a construction whose objective was and still is to portray Venezuela as a narco state, that is, a rogue state with which nothing can or should be negotiated, Coupled with this narrative, Nicolás Maduro would therefore no longer be a president, but rather the cartel's kingpin, and in consequence would be dispossessed of the power and legitimacy of a head of state, end quote. And he argues that what the US government is trying to do with these accusations is to justify a military intervention to overthrow President Maduro by claiming that supposedly he's not actually president, but rather a so-called narco-terrorist. And this Spanish scholar pointed out that this is exactly what the US government did in 1989 to overthrow the previous leader of Panama, Manuel Noriega. The US invasion of Panama, which was carried out by President George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., who had been director of the CIA, and he invaded Panama in 1989, it was completely illegal according to international law. The US military killed hundreds of people in Panama, and then they overthrew the leader, Manuel Noriega, and extradited him to the US, kidnapped him, and imprisoned him in the US. And the biggest irony of all is that in order to justify this illegal invasion, the US government said they had to overthrow Noriega because he was a drug trafficker. But Noriega previously worked for the CIA. And the US president who overthrew Noriega, George H.W. Bush, was the former director of the CIA. He knew that Noriega had worked for the CIA. The CIA knew that Noriega was a drug dealer. That's one of the reasons they supported him for so long. But just like how the CIA had also previously supported Saddam Hussein in Iraq, he was also a dictator backed by the US when it supported the interests of the US empire. And then when he was no longer useful, the US empire threw him out and invaded Iraq. The US government did the exact same thing in Panama, and that was overseen by George Bush Sr., just like how George Bush Jr. carried out the invasion of Iraq in 2003, just 14 years later. So it's obvious that the strategy of the Trump administration is to try to falsely link the Venezuelan government, and in particular Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, to drug cartels without any evidence in order to justify US intervention in yet another coup attempt to overthrow the left-wing president in Venezuela, which is of course closely allied with China and Russia and Iran and Cuba, the main geopolitical adversaries standing in the way of the US empire's unipolar dominance of the planet. This is why the Trump administration has also been accusing the Venezuelan government of supposedly being linked to another drug cartel called Tren de Aragua. However, the Trump administration has faced a big problem, which is that US intelligence agencies admitted that President Maduro is not the leader of this cartel. He's not working secretly with a Venezuelan drug cartel. NPR obtained a declassified memo from the US Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which says, this is the head of the US intelligence community saying, quote, "The Maduro regime probably does not have a policy of cooperating with TDA, that is Tren de Aragua, and is not directing Tren de Aragua's movement to and operations in the United States," end quote. This is bombshell evidence from US spy agencies that are spying all around Venezuela and all around the world. They know that it's false. And yet the Trump administration is spreading this lie in order to justify another coup attempt and US meddling in Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro, just like how the George Bush administration fabricated the lie of weapons of mass destruction in order to invade Iraq in an illegal colonial war in 2003. So now that we know from US intelligence agencies that this is a complete lie, that President Maduro is not working with drug cartels, what is the strategy of the Trump administration? Well, it's to say, no, they're wrong. In fact, the New York Times obtained internal documents showing how the Trump administration is trying to force intelligence agencies, which are supposed to be independent, to change their intelligence assessments in order to justify the US coup attempt in Venezuela. The New York Times obtained internal emails that show how a top aide named Joe Kent, who works for the US Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, and he has been trying to force analysts to rewrite their assessment to falsely link President Maduro to this drug cartel, Tren de Aragua. So this is a WMD-style disinformation operation to try to deceive the public to manufacture consent for another U.S. coup attempt in Venezuela. And I have to say that the Trump administration's rhetoric about Tren de Aragua has been completely absurd. The Trump administration has deported hundreds of people from the U.S. to El Salvador to a prison, imprisoning immigrants without trial, without due process, with no civil rights whatsoever, and as so-called evidence that these immigrants being deported to a foreign prison by the Trump administration, the so-called proof that they're members of this supposed drug cartel, Tren de Aragua, the Trump administration is using the fact that they have tattoos. And what are these tattoos? If you have a tattoo of a star or a crown or an AK-47 or Michael Jordan, then they claim that that's evidence that supposedly you're in a drug cartel, you're in a gang, and the Trump administration will send you to prison in El Salvador with no charges, with no trial. And there was a huge scandal in Venezuela because the Trump administration deported a gay makeup artist who obviously was not in any way associated with gangs. This guy was an openly gay makeup artist who was an immigrant in the US. The Trump administration deported him because he had tattoos, and he said he was tortured in this prison in El Salvador. And I know that throughout this analysis today, I've repeatedly said that the hypocrisy of US foreign policy is jaw-dropping, but every time you learn more, it just becomes more and more stunning. The levels of deceit and dishonesty and hypocrisy and double standards. Because the coup puppet, whom the Trump administration tried to impose as the unelected so-called president of Venezuela, Juan Guaidó, he himself is also linked to drug cartels in Venezuela. This is the puppet that the US wanted to put in power in Venezuela. Literally, like I said earlier, it is not an exaggeration. The closer a politician in Latin America is to the United States, the more likely they are to be a drug dealer or linked to drug cartels. Juan Guaidó is another good example. In 2019, Guaidó smuggled himself across the border between Colombia and Venezuela into Venezuela as part of a PR stunt to get support for this US-led coup attempt. And in order to smuggle himself across the border, Juan Guaidó and his coup gang, backed by the US government, collaborated directly with a drug cartel known as Los Rastrojos, which is a notorious drug gang that has not only been linked to drug trafficking, but also assassinations and money laundering and kidnappings. These guys are murderers. They are cold-blooded killers. And even mainstream newspapers like the Spanish newspaper El País reported on this back in 2019 at the peak of the US-led coup attempt in Venezuela. They were asking, why is Juan Guaidó taking photos with these notorious drug dealers and gangs? And there was another scandal in media outlets in Latin America about even more corruption involving Juan Guaidó and his coup gang. They received $700 million of so-called aid from the US government through the so-called U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which is actually just a front for the CIA. And this coup gang received $700 million from USAID, and no one knows what actually happened with that money. All that money disappeared and went into the pockets of these corrupt criminals trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government with the support of the US government. And a lot of that money also probably went to these drug dealers whom they were obviously collaborating with. Because these drug dealers are the closest allies of the US empire in Latin America. Because these are people who are more than willing to sell out their country and sell out their people and accept bribes and engaged in criminal activity with the CIA, with the DEA, with other US government agencies to carry out coups and regime change operations on behalf of the US empire. There is a perfect word in Spanish for these people. They are known as vendepatrias, which means literally to sell your homeland. These coup puppets like Juan Guaidó and these right-wing oligarchs like Álvaro Uribe in Colombia, they are vendepatrias. They sell out their country and work with drug dealers and criminals on behalf of the U.S. empire to benefit U.S. corporations and U.S. economic and political interests in Latin America, helping the U.S. empire try to colonize Latin America as part of its so-called Monroe Doctrine, which is a 200-year-old colonial doctrine, and the Trump administration has boasted that it's trying to bring back that colonial doctrine. Donald Trump's former national security advisor, the neocon war criminal John Bolton, after he left the first Trump administration, he published a memoir, and in his book, John Bolton said that the reason that the Venezuelan leftist government of President Maduro was a threat was because it was closely allied with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, and therefore violated the U.S. empire's colonial Monroe Doctrine. They're proud of this. And during the previous coup attempt carried out by the first Trump administration, John Bolton admitted that U.S. corporations wanted to exploit Venezuela's oil.
We're looking at the oil assets. That's the single most important income stream to the government of Venezuela. We're looking at what to do to that. We want everybody to know we're looking at all this very seriously. We don't want any American businesses or investors caught by surprise. They can see what President Trump did yesterday. We're following through on it.
So if you think of a company like Citgo, which is owned by PDVSA, which is the state-run oil company there in Venezuela, we have a lot of those Citgo assets right here in the U.S. Is that something, for example, sir, that you're looking at?
Yeah, well, we're in conversation with major American companies now that are either in Venezuela or, in the case of Citgo, here in the United States. I think we're trying to get to the same end result here. You know, Venezuela is one of the three countries I call the troika of tyranny. It'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil capabilities in Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of Venezuela. It'd be good for the people of the United States. We both have a lot at stake here, making this come out the right way.
John Bolton said that back in 2019 at the peak of the previous coup attempt in Venezuela. That one failed. And now today in 2025, the Trump administration is launching another coup attempt in Venezuela. But meanwhile, secretly behind the scenes, you know what Trump is doing? He's quietly giving the green light for the major U.S. oil corporation Chevron to pump oil in Venezuela. So it's so obvious what the goal of the U.S. government is. The U.S. wants to overthrow the independent leftist anti-imperialist government of Venezuela, which is an ally of China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, and install a U.S. puppet regime. And then, of course, the U.S. wants the U.S. puppet, like whoever it is, Juan Guaidó Part 2, the U.S. wants that puppet to privatize all of the oil in Venezuela and to sell it to U.S. corporations like Chevron. That's the goal that the U.S. government has for all of Latin America. It's to colonize the region, to exploit its natural resources, to overthrow all of the independent governments, and to impose the colonial Monroe Doctrine. That is the stated policy of the Trump administration. But it's not just Trump. It's not just the Republicans. The Democrats have done the exact same thing for decades. U.S. imperialism is completely bipartisan in Washington, and both parties have been terrorizing the people of Latin America, not just for decades, but for centuries. And the U.S. government has been more than willing to work with corrupt drug dealers and gang leaders and death squads and paramilitaries to serve the interests of U.S. corporations and to prevent Latin America from joining this multipolar world, to keep the region trapped in the U.S. imperial so-called sphere of influence, to prevent the region from having close relations with China and Russia and Iran and other countries. This is imperialism. This is neo-colonialism. And when you look at what the U.S. government does in Latin America, if you study it even for a few hours, you can see that it has nothing to do with democracy and human rights. It is blatant, bald-faced imperialism. On that note, I'm going to conclude. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.